Man-Made Monsters is a show about the monsters we make, and the monsters we make ourselves into. It contains content related to fictional characters that it makes no claim to owning or creating, as well as content related to historical figures based on historical evidence, field-relevant scholarship, and primary source data. This show is sponsored by Veterans Fighting Fascism. Please consider visiting veteransfightingfascism.org to learn more about their organization or get involved in the work of democracy preservation. The show is made possible by viewers like you, especially those kind enough to leave a review, like it on the platform you're using, and share it with friends. If you would like to support the show directly, please consider subscribing to @JohnsterTruck on Patreon or by purchasing the book written by the creator, The Night Sky Darker, available on Amazon and Audible. Pierce Brown's Red Rising presents a world of class hierarchy driven to the absolute extreme, one where golds rule over a pyramid of lower castes with absolute power derived from their physical strength and mental ability, but also from their complete dominance of social, political, and economic institutions. We meet this world on Mars, or rather, beneath it in the person of Darrow. Darrow the Red, the lowest of the low classes, who toils under the watchful eye of gray enforcers and bronze functionaries, convinced of a lie that he is preparing the planet for later settlement. What he learns in those early chapters is how deep the lie goes, and how willing to kill the golds are to ensure that it is believed. After his wife is murdered for an act of protest, Darrow is recruited by a rebel group called the Sons of Ares, who rip the scales from his eyes. His world beneath the surface was a fiction. Mars was not only inhabited, but fully terraformed and civilized. His people, the Low Reds, were kept in complete isolation from the broader world and made to toil until their short lives were spent. Meanwhile, the solar system turned above them, straining under the weight of a golden boot heel. This realization radicalizes him and sets him on a path of destruction that will see planets burn and billions die. But first, Darrow has to infiltrate a gold society by undergoing a brutal surgery to make him into one, then survive a gauntlet that will allow him to join the most coveted of all ranks, a peerless guard. Throughout Darrow's long journey, we see inside a society built on the most extreme end of eugenics thinking, taken to the absolute furthest it could go. Genetic augmentation locks people into a class structure from birth, and terror keeps them from ever raising their heads to question why. Red Rising is set in a future version of our timeline, one where Gold Society has conquered Earth, then the stars. Because of this, Brown can draw very literally and directly on real-world history without impacting the continuity of his setting. Where many authors have to invent new names for ideas that exist in our world, then build a history into them that situates them within the setting, Brown can draw on our history directly. Words like fascism and eugenics are sprinkled throughout many of the books of the Red Rising saga, giving the Golds a history and ideological trajectory that feels real. In this episode, we will explore those real-world connections and see how history fits into fiction, or rather, how very little of the underpinnings of Brown's setting are fictional at all. In the Red Rising universe, much of the origins of Gold Society are left vague. This is mainly due to the fact that the specifics of their origins are not essential to Darrow's story, but it also serves as a useful narrative purpose, even if unintentional. That the society always was, that it is the natural order of things, that to question it is to question the thrust of history and nature themselves. However, the scant details presented in the Red Rising series tell of a lunar culture that was deeply hierarchical and patriarchal, one that distanced itself socially and economically from an earthborn civilization they saw as parasitic. In the vein of Ayn Rand's John Galt, the Gold saw the lesser peoples of Earth as useless eaters, supping on the success of their betters while simultaneously holding them back from true greatness. The Golds themselves began as a rank denoted by a colored uniform, but over time, and through genetic manipulation, enhanced their physical and mental capabilities such that they were superhuman when compared to Earth-born people. These Golds determined to break the yoke of their service to Earth through military might, and launched a crusade to conquer the nations of Earth that ruled them. The conquering would be this crusade. An iron rain, or orbital ship-to-surface landing, heralded the coming of the end of the old Earth order and the beginning of Gold Society headed by the Loon family. The militaries of Earth, factious and divided between national powers as they were wholly underprepared for this war against demigods that fell from the sky, and were crushed. What followed was the rapid consolidation of power by the Loon family through the Compact, a sort of constitution that formalized the tenets of the society and built a framework of governance on the maintenance of genetic hierarchies through a color system: golds to rule, silvers to manage finance, bronze bureaucrats, gray enforcers, and so on. Within these broader hierarchies were specific categories, each complete with their own specific genetic augmentations, but what's more, outfitted with their own systems of social expectation, education, and means of control. Genetic augmentations made members of the various classes biologically suited for the tasks delegated to them, and the vast network of social expectations, state surveillance, and terror assured that they would have little other choice than to do what they were bred for. It is a fascist order in the most literal sense of the word: to bind together. A new race order not born of the color of one's skin, but the color of one's class, each forced through propaganda and terror to serve a state built around a cult of personality, all under the auspices of a legal system that amounted to little more than words on paper. The law serves gold, not the other way around. The genetic component of the color hierarchy is more pronounced in some classes than others. For example, blues are biomechanically augmented such that they can interface into the ships they pilot. Reds are genetically short and physically strong, tailored for the manual labor they do. Obsidians wield a powerlifter's physique that make them perfect soldiers for the close quarters fighting of starship hallways. Golds are neurologically and physically enhanced, such that their mental and physical capabilities far outmatch any of the people they rule. However, the genetic engineering that the classes are subjected to is only one part of the system that keeps them all in line. Darrow's upbringing on Mars is a window into the world of class suppression beyond the genetic, and indeed shows that genetic augmentation is perhaps the least important part of maintaining the social order. Darrow's world is one of short lifespans, where he is considered a full adult in his mid teens, and the old men of his community are in their 30s. More than that, it is a world of vast media suppression and constant propaganda. The toil of the Reds is to be seen as a necessary, temporary sacrifice for the greater good of terraforming Mars for future settlement. He and his people are kept completely in the dark about the actual state of the solar system and their place in it. Their brief lives are one of constant competition, where the refrain of limited resources is hauled out as an excuse to keep the various clans of low reds in competition with each other for laurels, or special rewards of additional rations, comfort items, and medicine, given every so often based on productivity. This interclass conflict and occasional tilting of the scales to ensure that the clans are always suspicious of each other prevents any sort of class consciousness from forming. Without the formation of class identity and camaraderie, there can be no class level revolution. Moreover, education is totally absent. The low reds are not expected to read anything more complex than technical manuals, and thus are given no schooling that would allow them to do so. Without complex words, those gained from regular exposure to literature, one cannot develop complex thoughts. Without complex thoughts, one could not hope to dream of a freedom they do not have the words to describe. The social order inside the minds of Mars is one of deep homophobia, patriarchy, and obsession with the nuclear family. Homosexual relationships cannot produce offspring, and a regular restocking of the population is necessary due to the high mortality rates of mine workers. Therefore, those relationships are socially rejected, and people bearing those feelings are ostracized by their community. A patriarchal work culture where men do the most dangerous jobs, and therefore die much younger, ensures that the women remain alive through all their most fertile years, and can therefore produce more offspring to guarantee that no matter how low the life expectancy is, the death rate never outpaces the birth rate. The cultural centrality of bearing many offspring, and starting that process in one's teenage years, means that those most capable of organizing rebellion, the young, still healthy and strong, are too focused on keeping too many mouths fed with too little food to have any time to think about anything other than meeting the next quota. Throughout the Red Rising saga, we get windows into the different social lives of the various classes beyond Red. Blues are raised with minimal privacy and an obsession with objectivity and the suppressing of emotions in order to make them more capable crewmen on ships. Obsidians follow ritualistic pagan traditions and are cultivated into a culture of magical thinking and the belief in the golds as literal demigods. The golds themselves have much more variety in their cultural expectations and social systems, depending on the family they are from. But even at the top of the pyramid, covetousness and self obsession with status are encouraged to ensure the tyranny of the Loon family is never more of a concern than achieving the next rank or otherwise flaunting the current ones over others. The Golds are granted prestige and comfort in many respects as a reward of their superior genetics, but indeed these comforts and advantages are just velvet covered manacles to bind them as surely as suffering binds the low reds. Golds are taught they are the pinnacle of human evolution, the absolute top of the food chain, and the nurturing of this thinking creates narcissism and cynical drive that make it impossible for many Golds to see beyond their self obsession. Golds are plied with wealth, status, and an endless list of pleasure slaves they can distract themselves with. All the while, the fragility of their status is never kept far from view. There will always be a Gold more golden than they, always a rank higher than theirs. This ensures that they drink and fuck and climb one social ladder toward another rather than ever dare to consider the context into which they fit, or how often they are used to prop up the Loon dynasty at their own expense. Within these broad and deep social strata are odd men out, who see themselves as the good Golds, those that hold values contrary to the narcissism and megalomania encouraged in others of their color. The Raw House, for example, holds themselves as the exemplars of the original virtues of society, that of restraint, industriousness, and virtue. On the raw controlled moons of Saturn, the lower colors are not obviously subjected to cruelty, the use of sex slaves is discouraged, and the flaunting of wealth and status for vanity's sake is frowned upon. However, the existence of the Ra within the broader context of the society only further serves the goals of the Loon family. By having paragons of virtue, ones who hold themselves to older and better traditions, the society can strip status from unruly golds as it sees fit, however cynically, then hold their debauchery or lack of chivalry as a despised party up against the shining example of Ra values. It is equally useful that the Ra are far away from the seat of power on Loon, which grants them a mystique that only distance and vagary can provide. Were one to see them up close too often, they would realize that their virtue is a sham, just like everything else in gold. What we see then is a social order of genetic and social engineering designed to separate men from their brethren in every conceivable way, then stunt their emotional and intellectual development such that they are unable to see beyond their individual plights, that they might develop any form of solidarity within or without their own class identity. This stunting might be in the form of genetic modification, the restriction of education, the enforcement of terror, or even the overabundance of pleasure, but it all serves the same end. Ensure Loon and Luna are supreme over all. Octavia All Loon, the sovereign of the solar system, is the cult of personality around which the whole fascist state is wrapped. In her, we see a supreme cynicism and realism of a kind that we don't witness in the other characters in the series. She understands that the whole thing is rotten to the core, but those molding floorboards are still strong enough to hold her over everyone else's head, and so they remain in place. From her seat on Luna, she hands out favors and terror in equal measure, ensuring that the social classes stay divided from each other, from themselves, such that she and her family can rule unchallenged. This, of course, collapses rather rapidly throughout the first three books of the Red Rising saga. What Red Rising demonstrates so strikingly is a fantastical overpresentation of the real world concept of eugenics and social Darwinism, two now defunct theories of human development that drove the very worst of human behavior throughout the Industrial Revolution and into the 20th century. The world of the Industrial Revolution is one of striking social and economic inequality. Industrial output, technological development, and monopolization had far outpaced state regulation in the United States and elsewhere. This created an environment of rampant corruption and self dealing, as monopolistic enterprises bullied the local governments in which they operated, and in many cases became states unto themselves through the establishment of company towns and the employment of private security contractors to maintain order in their workplaces. Beneath the smoke of constantly burning chimneys, a new social class was developing en masse: the working poor. These were people who worked wage labor jobs on assembly lines and in resource extraction, who, despite toiling for long hours, never managed to earn an income capable of supporting a minimum standard of living. These people lived in cramped apartments called tenements, often without running water or adequate insulation from the weather, and paid out significant portions of their meager wages to slumlords who preyed on their poverty. The cramped conditions and absence of basic sanitation services ensured that disease ran rampant, carried on the backs of animal infestations and in the coughing, wheezing lungs of the overworked masses. The suffering of disease and malnutrition was compounded by unsafe working conditions that led to constant loss of life and limb in the factories and mines in which these people were employed. It was an easy world to die in, meaning orphans clogged the streets of most American and British industrial centers. Naturally, these miserable conditions created a demand for reform and inspired radical opposition from the workers forced to endure them. Labor organizations formed to strike, protest, and occasionally riot against their lot. Investigative journalists, called muckrakers, scoured the country looking for stories that might bring light on the conditions people endured and the corruption that created them. Men like Jacob Riis used photographs of child laborers to awaken the sympathy of the broader public. Women like Ida Tarbell used spycraft to investigate the illegal activities of monopolies. Organizations opposed to the exploitation popped up around the country and quickly gained members, and the force derived from the weight of numbers. The industrialist class had methods to deal with these reforms. Convict leasing, or the practice of arresting and enslaving convicted criminals, ensured that the most dangerous or demeaning of tasks could be relegated to people with fewer rights and less access to representation on the job site. Those leased inmates could then be brought in to replace striking workers or disincentivize the formation of unions through the threat of replacing unionized staff with inmates. Sharecropping in the American South gutted any form of rural progressive action by ensuring that semi slavery was reintroduced to the region. The sharecropping method was one where farm workers, mostly black farm workers, would rent land and equipment to till, then live off loans from the landlord until the harvest was collected. When they got their wages, the expenses of their rents and loans were deducted, leaving them with barely anything to show for their toil. Child labor expanded rapidly, as menial or low skilled tasks could be relegated to children, usually orphans or immigrants, to damage the ability of the adult workforce to unionize. Many of these children depended on their meager wages to feed themselves or cover their board at orphanages, and so were entirely unable to risk participating in any sort of behavior that might see those wages threatened with firing. This dreadful world requires ideas to justify it, or else the pesky reformers, called progressives, might actually make gains toward their goals of safety standards, minimum wage laws, and restrictions on child labor. To this end, many ideas were deployed and developed throughout the late 1800s to ensure that the changes to the system were blunted by the claims of their futility. The sharecropping and convict leasing system of the American South gave rise to early segregation practices, ensuring that ethnic groups were kept separate from each other, and therefore kept in opposition with each other. White, black, and immigrant workers were kept in constant competition with each other for jobs. The workers of one ethnic group could be brought in to replace the labors of the other while on strike. Furthermore, housing costs could be artificially inflated by only allowing one ethnic group or another to live in certain neighborhoods or apartments. In the world of Red Rising, color has to do with the rank branded into one's hand. In our world, it is the color pigmented into one's skin. However, the ideas propping up segregation were quickly losing traction to modernity. Old notions of the quote, white man's burden didn't hold up to the modern demands of industry. Where the slaveholding class of the Old South promised that it was burdened with the care, housing, and moral development of the people they enslaved, these new industrialists were not interested in even pretending to value something besides their own profits. It was hard to manage the old lie of a white man's burden when the industrialists couldn't be burdened by anything other than their own bottom line. The decline in popularity of the white man's burden ran alongside a growing cultural fascination with the sciences. For all the troubles brought about by industrialization, it also brought about technological advances more akin to magic. Electric light bulbs, ready made clothing, and new developments in food production and storage, moving pictures, early ventures in flight, the telephone, and photography were but some of the litany of inventions created or advanced during the Industrial Revolution. All of these within a single person's lifetime. The vague mysticism and religiosity that upheld much of the human understanding about the world was rapidly losing its purchase. God was, perhaps, dead. We, perhaps, killed him. This proved problematic for the white man's burden, which used allusions to the mystic or the divine to uphold its values. The Christian European was superior, not due to their ethnic stock, but due to something else. Perhaps it was their religious values. Perhaps it was their cultural structures. Perhaps it was direct intervention of the divine. In a world of automobiles and penicillin, these dalliances with the ethereal no longer carried the weight of explanation that they used to. Among the multitude of discoveries and developments of the Industrial Revolution, the most significant were in medicine. Professional doctoring was beginning in earnest, especially in Germany, where the best medical schools in the world were quickly building a reputation for themselves. Vaccines, painkillers, and all manner of surgical advances led humanity on a crusade against death that raised life expectancies throughout the Western world. A general sentiment developed in medicine that it was the answer to all of life's ailments, and medical science would bring about a golden age of humanity. It is a combination of these two notions, that the white man's burden is behind the times and medical science is the wave of the future, that ushered in eugenics. Darwin's theories on evolution and survival of the fittest were gaining easy ground in this age of scientific advancement, but his ideas about biological developments were quickly adapted to social behavior as well. Social Darwinism, or the belief that people's behavior was a byproduct of evolution more so than social influences, filled the gaps that God left behind in the white man's burden. Notions that social welfare was worthless because the socially or economically incapable were born that way took hold. It was easy, compatible thinking with the greed of industrialists, who loathed regulations being placed on them or taxes being extracted from them to fund social programs. Social Darwinism explained that the low-born deserved their lot, and the successful too were made for the success as a product of evolution building them that way. It served to justify the segregation practices of the Deep South against African Americans, just as well as it explained, for reasons of science, not bigotry, of course, that Americans in the North and East were suspicious of migrants from China, Ireland, and Eastern Europe. It is here where we find our first direct parallel between the world of Red Rising and ours, that the Golds were born better, the finish line of the evolutionary tree, and found no fault or contradiction in the fact that they manipulated that evolutionary tree to ensure they were born better and others worse. Just as the Golds were comfortable looking away from their own hand and their relative superiority, the racists and industrialists of our world found a convenient dumping ground for progressive ideas in the wake left by social Darwinism. Their own manipulations of the social system that kept people poor and badly educated were no longer worth considering. Social Darwinism, however, was but a stepping stone to the final form of justification for why some people were better off and others worse so. In the late 1800s, Sir Francis Galton of England devised a theory of eugenics that would absorb the various strains of social caste justification and gloss them all in science. Eugenics, or the attempt to bring about a superior form of man through the controlling of reproduction, was born. Galton theorized that genetic traits passed from parent to child were most responsible for all manner of outcomes in a person's life, be they physical, mental, or behavioral. That one's IQ, creative capacity, and even likelihood of social deviance could be determined by their genetic stock. If this is the case, then social progress was propagated or hampered by breeding more than any other single factor, and scientific methods could be deployed to determine who was the best suited for reproduction and who was not. Then, further scientific methods could be deployed to ensure that those most fit to reproduce did so most often, and those least fit reproduced least often. Eugenics provided a veneer of rationality to all the various forms of bigotry in the West, such that the bigot no longer had to listen to the criticisms of their opponents as being small minded. Indeed, they were the ones in pursuit of great mindedness, while their critics were the ones holding humanity back. In this view, there was no need for social welfare programs to help the poor because they could not be helped. No amount of economic redistribution could change their genetic stock. Arguments about curtailing immigration, especially from non Europeans, no longer had to rely on economic argument to cover their racism at all. Instead, an opponent of immigration could simply point out the potential for harm if lesser races of man entered the population and reproduced with them. Furthermore, the segregation policies of the American South were entirely justified due to the fear of race mixing diluting the purity of white breeding stock. The staying power of these ideas comes from their connection to truth just as much as it does their justifications for bigotry. It is true that some diseases are hereditary. It is true that many traits are passed from parent to child, especially the superficial ones regarding appearance. It is true, and became a popular pastime, that animals such as dogs could be selectively bred to produce desirable traits in temperament and appearance. Were one to make an argument about the need to control the reproduction of the human animal, they need not say anything racist or bigoted at all. Instead, they could point to how different breeds of dog look and behave, how different parentages for horses produced different qualities of offspring, how different species of creature, and different types within those categories, varied widely in their appearance and temperament. Then, simply assert that the same sort of genetic outcomes were present in humans as well. Eugenics took off in popularity, spawning all manner of public relations campaigns to promote its practice. In Iowa, state fairs hosted better baby contests that framed eugenics as a positive social good. The British government sponsored propaganda campaigns to curb hereditary disease by discouraging undesirable reproduction. Dog breeding as a hobby for the wealthy took off. All along the way, medical doctors and researchers praised progress for humanity made not of social welfare programs, but of genetic hygiene. This control of reproduction is carried to extreme ends in Red Rising, as we covered earlier, but ends not so extreme that they disconnect from our reality. The natural next stage of eugenic thinking was that different races were relegated to the fields they worked in by genetic destiny, not by social systems or legal restrictions. Just as the low reds toiled and the coppers managed bureaucracy, black and brown bodies worked on the lowest rungs of the economic ladder as sharecroppers and leased convicts under the management of their Anglo-Saxon bosses. The comparative justifications for segregation practices between the colors of Red Rising and the colors of humanity are obvious, if only barely enhanced in the fictional world. Just as the education systems of Red Rising's color hierarchy are tailored to ensure that all parties are only just intelligent enough to do the work laid out for them, segregation in the American South had the same effect. Black schools were worse funded, staffed, and facilitated. In many cases, black families were so poor they had to limit their children's education in favor of sending them to work. However, this curtailing of education was not limited to the obvious victims of segregation. Just as gold was propagandized toward their own greatness, the Anglo-South was similarly influenced. Textbooks were revised by Confederate apologists to lie about the course and causes of the Civil War, as well as downplay the severity of slavery and upsell the inevitability of the current order. In fiction, and in reality, terror was used to quash any resistance to this system. Paramilitary violence from the Klan is certainly the most well known of the South's excesses in defense of segregation, but it was also its least effective. Endless social surveillance from peers ensured that if anyone, white or black, crossed the color line to sup with their fellows as equals, they would be crushed entirely. Were a white man to sympathize with the plight of his black brothers and work toward their equality, or God help him, try to grant him social status in his community, his business would be boycotted, his children harassed, and quite possibly his house vandalized by the Klan. Were a white woman to see in her black sisters a kinship that she might try to help them, she could expect the tarnishing of her reputation and the ostracization of her family. We see several examples of this throughout the Red Rising saga, especially in the character of Ares. For fear of giving spoilers to a key plot point, I will leave it to those who are caught up with the series to draw those conclusions for themselves. Toward that end, the next development of a social world where eugenics justified racism that justified eugenics was a singular obsession with sex. There is ample debate as to why authoritarian systems, be they political or religious in nature, obsess over the sexual behaviors of others. It is possible that the ability to penetrate the most private room of a person's life serves as a useful deterrent for their behavior in more public forums. It is equally possible that the obsession with sex is not a cynical ploy for power, but instead a natural offshoot of the ideas of a regime obsessed with control. The greatest crime a non-white person could be accused of in the world of the late 18 and early 1900s was sexual relations with a white woman. The assumption was always rape, the outcome always incredible violence. Castration was a regular part of lynching, and the violence of the lynch mob was seldom sated by the murder of the accused. It often spilled over into the surrounding community, targeting both African Americans and their allies. However, the sexual obsession and condemnations associated with it only ever point down the power hierarchy, never up. If a white woman sleeps with a black man, the automatic assumption was that the black man raped her. If the inverse is true, it was assumed that the black woman sexually manipulated the white man into the act. In either case, condemnation focuses on the action of the dark skinned party and the inability of the light skinned party to do otherwise. The world of Red Rising circumvents this phenomenon slightly, though not entirely, through the existence of pinks. This social class existed for the pleasure of their betters, and served as sex slaves for the society. Despite their lower class status, men and women partook equally in the bodies of the pinks, regardless of the gender of either party. Despite the illegality of voluntary love partnerships across colors, exploitative sexual practices were not only encouraged, but provided for by the state. It was acceptable if it supported the society's power relationships, and unacceptable otherwise. The cultural obsession with sex is compounded by eugenic thinking, as it makes the private behavior of someone in their bedroom a matter of social consequence. If you or your partner possess those traits viewed as degenerate, then you will produce offspring who bear those traits, perhaps more of them, in themselves. That would create a rising number of degenerates who would then propagate, and thereby undermine society in the long term, as intelligence and creative capacity is thinned out of the gene pool by the presence of degeneracy. Therefore, as the eugenicist would argue, the private affair of sex is not private at all. To that end, states around the country and countries around the world passed laws allowing forced sterilization of the undesirable. Those who were poor or black were most often targeted under the guise of protecting the gene pool from suboptimal traits. This was often done without the knowledge of the victim, who would check themselves into a doctor and receive an entirely different procedure in addition to the one they were looking for. For women, this often happened during childbirth, where the victim would be given a surgical procedure that rendered them infertile without their knowledge or consent. The violation of the privacy of the one was seen as an acceptable sacrifice to preserve the genetic stock of the whole. The natural progression of social Darwinism and eugenics was a development in thinking that attributed the success of the great powers to the genetic stock of their majority ethnic group. After all, if individual behavior was the product of genetics, then perhaps cooperative behavior was as well. Culture, then, was the byproduct of the genetic makeup of its members, and failed cultures were the product of failed genetics. To that end, notions of equality or equitable status between nations were nonsensical. You've probably noticed that this creates a feedback loop where one idea justifies the other in a death spiral of circular reasoning that only leads to one place: an excuse for violence and exploitation visited by the powerful on the powerless. This is true in our world as it is in the world of Red Rising, where the high colors lord their stations over the others in a system of self justification that creates tolerance for all manner of abuse. This brings us to our final stage of social Darwinism and eugenics thinking, just as it connects us most closely to the world of Red Rising: the world of fascism. This noxious ideology was born of embitterment at the outcomes of World War I, and in a deep fear of the political left and their push for greater social and economic equality. Where the left spent the Industrial Revolution learning to reject race and nation in favor of class identity, social Darwinism and eugenics painted those things into essential components of the human condition. The formation of these ideas into political action is the only natural consequence of their popularity. If race begats culture begats nation, then it is the duty of national leaders to ensure the protection of race and nation at all costs. The story of humanity becomes one of race struggle, and the story of the modern world one of a struggle between nations as the greater seek to dominate the lesser. Gone are any leftover ideas of a burden on the powerful as stewards of the powerless, for eugenics frames the powerless as dead weight dragging down human progress. The word fascist literally means to bind together, and is a shifting of the left wing notion of class consciousness and class identity away from one's toil and toward one's racial identity. That the whole race, the whole nation, should be bound together for one single purpose: the perpetuation of itself in the eternal struggle. However, there would be those who oppose such binding, such actions to do it, and such identity being the thing doing the binding. Therefore, a strong central government must direct a binding of the people with, or against, their will. If it is true that genetics determine destiny, and Darwinian struggle applied to the social world as well as the animal kingdom, then it is the duty of the state to protect its people, its true people, from the degeneracy threatened by others, indeed, by the very existence of others. Fascists mold these ideas into political action through a system of government that snuffs out the individual as completely as it can. one that brokers no mercy for those that would detract from the race and nation by having independent thoughts or actions, no mercy for those unwilling to be bound into the whole. After all, the true people are the ones bound, and those outside of the in group are categorically defective and dangerous, and therefore must be destroyed. Red Rising shows us a fascist system piloted by literal superhumans, those who have enhanced their bodies and minds beyond mortal capability, and those who can command the wealth of planetary industry to see their ends carried out. It is in the application of fascism, not the ideas of it, where our real world connects to Red Rising. And it is in the application of fascism, not the ideas of it, where our real world connections to Red Rising break down. In the books, gold binds the colors together in its hierarchical pyramid through a totalizing system of control where newborns are made as they are, branded from birth, and an exacting system of complete social control is leveled against them. It is a hierarchy that allows no question or alternative, because there is no alternative world from which questions can spring from. In this view, Eo's sacrifice for the cause of liberty is one born spontaneously, one made without an example to follow or a history to draw from. It is the yearning, present and quiet, in all of us to free ourselves from chains. It is a beautiful idea. However, the fascists in our world do not have the advantage of generations of rule to entrench their systems. In our world, the fascists of the interwar years were fighting their way into power amidst democracies, or semi democracies, where people had grown quite used to making choices for themselves and expressing their independence through all manner of social behavior. Popular as it was, notions of eugenics and social Darwinism were not everyday parts of life for the average person, who was much more concerned with seeing to their work, enjoying their hobbies, and caring for their families. That means the fascists could not come to power through normal means, as doing so would require them to convince people that the daily motions of their life were the background noise of an eternal eugenic struggle. Such a thing would be patently ridiculous to someone with more practical concerns to worry about. The Reapers' rebellion against gold was one born of incredible violence because it had to be. In order to bring about a morally equitable system, the old one had to be ripped out root and branch. It had spent many lifetimes entrenching itself, and would require many billions of lives to be spent on digging it out.